Hey there, Emmanuel here from WebDevFuel and welcome back to this channel. Now, in today's video, we're going to continue with this tutorial in which we're going to learn exactly how to build a Golang and Svelte to-do list application. So we're basically going to be using Go on the backend and Svelte on the front end in order to build a to-do list application. Now, in the last video, which I released yesterday, we went over exactly how to set up our router and then how to create all of the CRUD operations. Now, in today's video, we're going to actually go over how to create, first of all, we're going to set CORS, which is cross-origin resource sharing, if I'm not mistaken, which essentially allows us to then connect our browser's client, which is Svelte, to the backend. And then after that, we're going to go over exactly how to set up the front end, so with Svelte more specifically. So with that being said, let's get started. Okay, so like I said, first of all, we need to go ahead and set up CORS. Now let's go back here to the browser and I'm going to simply show you exactly what the package is. So github.com/rs/CORS. And this is the package that we're going to be using in order to enable CORS. So again, cross-origin resource sharing on our website. Now, in the previous video, I mentioned that we would go ahead and use the CHI router, instead of using another kind of, let's say, package that sort of enabled everything for us. So authentication, even database connection, maybe all of that kind of stuff. Now, one of the reasons that I went ahead and chose that router particularly is because it is very good at connecting with the standard library. And what I mean by that is that, for example, this package, which is again called simply CORS, it is very simple for you to connect it to your Golang router, and it essentially connects very well with all of the other pieces. Now, this is usually not the case with other packages like Gin. So when I first started using Golang, I went over Gin and I experimented with it. I tried to build applications with it. And just like I told you, I didn't like the fact that it was very hard for me to then go ahead and implement different packages and sort of combine their functionality, because it is not 100% compatible with the Golang's standard library. And that is the reason we are using the She router, and it enables us to use here CORS in a very easy way. Now let's go ahead and copy this, and then inside here our project, we're going to again navigate to the backend and then paste this. Now this is simply go get github.com/rs/CORS. So let's go ahead and press enter, and now we have available to us this package inside our project. Now let's go here to the main file. Let's go back to the main file, and here inside the main file we're going to go ahead and do the following. We essentially want to use this as a we essentially want to wrap here the router around this CORS package, and then we need to pass the result from that wrapper in here. So let's go ahead and first of all say here c equals CORS.new, and this is going to automatically import, but you can go ahead and manually import here the github.com again /rs/CORS. So we need to create a new essentially a new configuration, and then we're going to pass in here CORS.options, and this is simply a struct, and we're going to say in here allowed origins are going to be string, and in here we want to go ahead and pass HTTP localhost 5173, which is going to be the port that we're going to be running Svelte on. And then we also want to go ahead and set up our allowed methods, which is going to be an array of strings. And then here, instead of actually passing the string, we're going to be using here the HTTP package from the standard library and passing here method get, method post, method delete, and finally http.method patch. Now, if you went over the previous video, and I encourage you to do that before you actually continue with this current one, you might remember that we went over how to, first of all, get a list of to-dos, then how to create, which is the post method, then delete, and finally patch, which is the method that we're going to be using to update data on our backend. Now, with that in mind, just like I said, we first of all need to create another handler, and this is going to be c.handler, and then we want to wrap this our current router here around this. And now here, instead of listening and serving on the local host 9000 and then passing in here, as you can see, this handler, we're going to pass the handler that we just created. And now we have already CORS enabled, and I think this is saying that I could not import. I just need to restart here my LSP server, and now this is not complaining. So again, we now have CORS enabled inside our website. So with that in mind, we can now move here back to our project folder, and let's go ahead and create our Svelte application using Vite. Now Vite is an alternative to Webpack, so essentially it allows us to essentially grab our JavaScript files and essentially make them work on the browser. So in order to do that, you first of all need to have node install, npm, and in this case yarn. I'm going to be using yarn. If you don't know how to install this, let me know in the comments below, because I can make a future video about that. But with that in mind, let's go ahead and type simply yarn create Vite and then -- template. And Vite provides us essentially with multiple templates, even for React TypeScript, Svelte TypeScript. But in this situation, in this case, we're simply going to be using here just Svelte. So I'm going to be naming this project. Let's name this snappy to do. And then later I'm going to, after this completes, it completed very quickly. So I'm simply going to rename this folder now to Frontend. And now, as you can see, this is more clear because we have in here our backend and our front end separately in different folders. Now let's go ahead and navigate to the front end folder, and now simply type yarn in order to install all of the dependencies that this project needs. And again, if you're using npm, it is npm install in order to make this happen. Okay, so now as you can see, this has already gone ahead and installed all of the dependencies that we need for this project. So let's go ahead and start our development server. And just like I said, this has started here on port 5173. And now if we navigate here back to 5173, as you can see, we now have here a Vite plus Svelte application running. And as you can see, we can increase here this counter. So now we have our application working. So we need to go ahead and install a couple of things. We're going to first of all start with Tailwind CSS, and I prefer to use this over just plain CSS or even a library that provides more things, because I think this is the perfect, let's say, abstraction between like raw CSS, if you want to think about it like that, and something like Chakra or even Material UI, which is something that comes with a lot more stuff pre-built, and it usually complicates things instead of simplifying it for us. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and type in here yarn add -d. So this is a dependency, a development dependency. And then we want to go ahead and install Tailwind CSS, post CSS, auto prefixer, and finally we want to go ahead and install something which is sort of additional to everything that we need, which is going to be Tailwind CSS /forms. Now we're going to be using this because it is going to allow us to essentially style our forms in a much simpler way than usually you could do without having this library installed. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and install all of this. And now with all of this installed, we can go ahead and type in here npm tailwind css init for and then you want to pass in here the p flag. And now, as you can see, so the p flag is for post CSS, so it also goes ahead and creates the post CSS config file and also the Tailwind CSS configuration file. So now if I go ahead and let's do here an ls, as you can see, we have in here tailwind.config.cjs and also the same thing for post CSS. So now let's go ahead and navigate here to our Tailwind configuration file. And as you can see, we have a couple of things in here. We have the content, the plugins, which is where we're going to be enabling essentially Tailwind CSS forms, the plugin. And also we have in here theme extend, which is where we can later extend our theme, essentially that Tailwind provides by default. So now inside of this file, we simply need to go ahead and type the following. So type ./source, then **, and then .svelte. Now what this pattern essentially means is that we want to look for Tailwind CSS content, so for the classes, inside all of the files that end with .svelte inside of the source folder. So now if we go ahead and save this, we can also go ahead and now enable our forms plugin. So we simply need to type this in here. And again, this is the same thing that we installed right here. So it again simply goes ahead and enables us to create nice looking forms. And you're going to see what I mean by that in just a second. Now we need to, the next step actually is to go ahead and create here a CSS folder, a CSS file. So let's call this one index.css. And inside of this file, we need to first of all add Tailwind base, then Tailwind components, and finally Tailwind utilities. Okay, so these are the 3 rules that we need to essentially add here to this CSS file, and this is going to pull all of these things, only the things that we actually need. So this is not going to be pulling all of the stuff from Tailwind, but it is going to pull essentially everything that we need in order to make sure that we have Tailwind enabled inside of our application. And now the final step is to go ahead and open here index. So let's go here, it's the main actually, it's not index, main.js file. And inside the main.js file, I'm going to simply go ahead and replace this line with index because I don't want to have, so let's go back here. So this is the file that Svelte, when we create the application by default, comes with. So it comes with all of these styles, but we don't have to want them. And actually I can go ahead and delete this. And instead of importing that file, again, it was like this, we need to go ahead and import here index.css. Now, just to make sure that all of this works, let's go back here to our app.svelte file. And let's delete, let's say, this thing right over here. Then we also want to delete, so just leave the main tag in here. And then inside the main tag, let's create a p tag, which is going to have the styles of text 5XL, font bold, text center, and margin top of 24, which equals 96 pixels. And then inside of here, let's, for example, add an hello world. So now if we go back here to our front end and restart the server, if we did everything correctly, as you can see, we now have in here Tailwind CSS working, and it is all good, ready to go for us to start creating our to-do list application. So now let's go ahead and start by first of all creating our tasks component. So I'm going to create in here, let's create first of all a components folder, and then inside of this components folder, I'm going to create a tasks.svelte. Now let's navigate here to this file, and now let's start by first of all adding the essentially the code that we need in order to fetch all of our tasks. And we can start the server in just a second. For now we still don't need this. So let's create first of all a script tag, and then start by creating here a variable of tasks. Then another one here is loading of true. So we essentially want to hold the value of all of the tasks inside of this variable, and then if we want to track if this is loading or not, and once the application loads, by default this is true, so we can start by setting the value, the boolean value of true by default. So the next thing that we want to do, we're going to be using here the fetch API. We don't need Axios or none of that stuff. We're going to keep this simple and just use the fetch API. And we want to go ahead and fetch here from localhost 9000 /tasks. And then we want to do a couple of things. First of all, the method is going to be get, because we want to get data. We want to pass in here to the headers application type of the content type of application JSON. And finally, after we get this back from the server, so then essentially runs after the promise is returned to us, we want to make sure that this is asynchronous, and let's pass in here our response. And then we want to mutate here the value of task, so we're going to simply leave it like this, task. So you use this original variable name over here, await res.json. So every time that we call here the JSON method from the response object, we need to await it in order to make sure that we get the response back. And then we're going to set here is loading to false, because after we load, it is not not loading anymore. And then we want to go ahead and catch here the promise. So if anything goes wrong, we want to pass in here the error. We're going to simply go ahead and console log error fetching tasks from backend, and we'll pass in here the error. And now, just like here, we simply go ahead and set this as loading to false. So again, let's go over what's happening here. We're going to fetch, the method is get, headers simply application JSON, the content type is application JSON. And then if the promise goes well, if everything goes well, we simply set here the tasks as the JSON response. And we set this loading as false because we want to show in the UI the data only when this is not loading anymore. And finally, we want to go ahead and catch this error, console log if anything goes wrong, and then set is loading as false. All right, so now the next step is for us to add the HTML that's going to allow us to navigate here back to our browser and see all of the changes. So let's start by first of all setting in here a div tag, and this is going to have the classes of MX Auto. So this essentially centers this on the page. Then we're going to have border gray 300. So this essentially enables the border, and then this sets the color of the border. Then we want to have here rounded LG, so which it's essentially a large corner rounded, so it is going to have the border radius of 8 pixels. Then we also want to set the margin top at 24. The max width of this is going to be 640. And then and it actually at this, when the screen becomes this size, it is always going to be the size of the screen, and if it is larger, it is going to always be this size, so it becomes responsive automatically, which is really nice. And then finally the padding on the top and the bottom is going to be 2.5, and then the padding here is going to be like this. So now inside of this div tag, we want to make in here an if statement. So if is loading, we want to add in here our p tag with a simple message that says loading. Now you can go ahead later and add, let's say, a spinner or something like that, but For now, we're going to keep it simple and leave it like that. So next, here on the else statement, instead of having simply an else, we're going to make an else if. So if it is loading, we're going to show this. If it is not loading and we have the tasks, we're going to show the following. And then let's simply go ahead and close this. So we can go ahead and close this in here. So I'm going to close the if. And it's saying now that we have an empty block, but we're going to go ahead and simply pass this in here. So essentially, if this is loading, it is going to show this. If we have a task, it is going to show this. And if not, it is not going to show anything. Now, you could add another if statement to show the error message or something like that. But again, we don't need this at the moment. So now in here, we want to iterate over all of our tasks. So we need to add in here an each statement. So for each task as task, let's also go ahead and close in here this each. So again, we're going to iterate over each one of these tasks inside of the array. And we're going to show here some kind of HTML for each one of the iterations. Now we're going to simply pass in here the class of p2.5, then rounded LG, flex, justify between, items center, and then on hover we want to have the background color of gray 100. Alright, so now inside of this we want to create another div tag, which is also going to be of display flex, the item centered, and the space between each one of the items is going to be of 4, which equates to 16 pixels. Now again, this is how you want to calculate things inside of Tailwind CSS. Each time that I add here a number, it is this number times 4, so 4 times 4, 16, 20, so on and so on. So now inside of this tag, we want to go ahead and add the following. Let's start by first of all adding in here the input, which is going to be a checkbox. So this is going to be the checkbox that is going to allow us to toggle our to-do list state. And then the value is going to be task.done. And if the task.done is true, we're going to pass in here a string of true, and if not, a string of false. And we also want to go ahead and style this. And like I told you, the reason that we went ahead and installed Tailwind CSS forms is because for things like a checkbox and also later the normal text input, we can simply style this with CSS classes. And it makes it very easy to simply go ahead and do something like this. So text blue 800, focus ring blue 400. And yeah, only these three classes, and this is going to make the checkbox look very nice by default, and we don't have to do a lot of messing around with CSS. And now here, let's create a p tag with pointer events none, and inside of this p tag, we're simply going to have the task.name. So in here it is going to show the name of the task, and here the current state, if it is done or not. Now let's go ahead and continue. So we can exit this particular div tag. Yeah, so we can add in here another div tag, and we can go ahead and add in here flex items center space x2. And then we're going to start by creating a button that is going to have the class of text gray 700. On hover, it is going to have text blue 800. And inside of this button, we want to add the following. So we want to go ahead and add some kind of icon that is going to essentially show us that this is the button that is going to edit this current to do. So let's go back here to the browser and search hero icons Tailwind. And as you can see, we have here this website, which is created by the same people that created Tailwind CSS. And we can go ahead and search here for a pencil. And then if we go ahead and click here on copy SVG, we can paste this in here, save to format. And then instead of having here the width of 6 and height of 6, we're going to change this to 5. And also we want to go ahead and add here inside of the button a span that is going to have the class of SR only. So this is only for accessible devices. So this is not going to show up on your browser, but it's for essentially for accessibility purpose. When the person can't see this icon right over here, is going to simply show up this. So I'm going to go here SR only Tailwind CSS. And as you can see, it is only for screen readers. So it is going to apply all of these properties by default with a simple class. And inside of this, we need to identify essentially what this means. So it is the edit task button. So simply keep it like this, edit task. Okay, so now that we have our task.svelte component created, we can go ahead and move back here to the app.svelte file and go ahead and import this into it. So as you can see, it auto imports here from tasks, from components tasks.svelte. But if it doesn't auto import for you, you can go ahead and import it manually. Now with this done, we can go ahead and start our backend server. So I'm going to simply navigate here to this project, to the to the backend, and then I can go simply ahead and type in here go run dot. So this is going to run the entire project inside of this folder. And now if we go back here to our browser, as you can see, it shows all of the tasks, but we actually did something wrong. So we need to essentially go ahead and grab this tag and add it in here. So make sure that you first of all have this tag. So this is going to essentially flags everything. So I'm going to just show you here. So this is essentially going to flex everything like this. We're going to have in here a checkbox. We're then going to have in here the name of the task. And finally, we should have in here a button that allows us to edit. So now, as you can see in here, this is what happens. And this thing toggles. For now, it doesn't happen anything on the page, but we already have all of the elements that we need in order to create this to-do list application. Okay, so the next step is for us to go ahead and create in here a new task.svelte component. And instead of having all of this code in here, we're going to simply move each one of the tasks into its own component in order to be able to handle all of not only the rendering, so the visual part, but also all of the state. So again, creating here a task.svelte file inside of the components folder. And let's start by creating in here a script tag, and in here export a new variable, which is going to be task. Now this is essentially going to allow us in here to pass the current tasks from all of those iterations. So now let's go ahead and move back here to this file, and we want to go ahead and everything that's inside of this each block, we want to go ahead, copy this and paste this in here. And now we can simply go ahead and import in here the task and pass in here each one of these tasks. So as you can see now, we go ahead, iterate, and then pass the current task iteration into this component. And then we're going to handle this, each one of the iterations inside this component, so we can essentially manage each one of those states. Okay, so the next step is for us to go ahead and add the ability to update a new task. So again, here inside the task.svelte file, because we are handling a particular task at the moment, so each time that let's say that we click here, we want something to happen only inside of this. So we want something to happen in here, and we want all of these to be left alone. So for that reason, we're going to be using here the task.svelte file. And in here, let's simply add a new function, which is going to be called toggle. We also need to pass in here the event. And then in here, similarly to the case where we in here fetch all of our tasks, we want to go ahead and use here the fetch API and then fetch from localhost 9000 from the tasks. But in this case, and again, if you went over the previous video, we want to go ahead and pass in here the ID so that the Golang application, so that our backend knows exactly what particular task it is updating the done state of. So we want to simply go ahead and pass in here task.id, and in this case the method, instead of being get, it is going to be the method patch. Next, we also want to go ahead and add in here the headers, which is going to be content type application JSON. And finally, and actually in this case, we also need to go ahead and pass in here a body, which is going to be JSON stringify. And in here, we want to go ahead and pass done as the e.current target.check. Now, here's exactly what's happening in here. Just like the previous case, we simply need to pass in here a path where we want to fetch this. So where we essentially want to make the request to. Then the method is going to be of patch because we are updating some kind of data in the server. Here the header, same thing, content type application JSON, and the body is going to be of JSON.stringify. Now, if you usually use Axios, you can simply go ahead and do something like this. So in here, you can usually just do something like this. So done true or done false. But in this case, because you are using the fetch API, it doesn't stringify it by itself. So we need to do it manually. So for that reason, we're going to simply have something like done and then false, and we need to JSON.stringify this, which is going to then result in something like this. So we're going to have, let's put this in backticks. So then we're going to have something like done, which is going to be false. So we're going to have something like this. Now, let's go ahead and add exactly everything that we need in order to make sure that we can toggle this here inside of this tag. And it's simply going to be adding in here a bind of checked, which is going to be task.done. So the value of checked is going to be binded to task.done. So each time that it changes, it also changes here inside of this input. And next we want to on change to go ahead and simply toggle this. So now if we move back here, as you can see, it now says that read a book, it is already done. And that's because we went ahead and binded this in here. And now if we go ahead and let's say that we want to say that we've already washed the dishes. Now if we refresh, as you can see, the state is permanent. And also if we go here to our tasks.json file, as you can see, wash the dishes is at the moment true. And if we go ahead and uncheck this, it updates because it is at the moment false. So now we are able to not only see all of our tests, but also update it. So the next step is for us to be able to essentially edit the current task's name. So let's say that we type in here something which will in the future add the ability to create a new task. If we, for some reason, make some mistake, we can go ahead and edit the name of our task. The first thing that we want to do is to go ahead and go here, below here the export LED task, and add a new value, which is going to be editing, which is going to start as false. And we're going to be using this variable essentially to track if the user is currently editing any one of our tasks. So again, in here, the state is going to be contained into each one of these tasks. So if they go ahead and click here at any moment, we want to change something here that allows us to essentially replace here this task with this text, so this p tag essentially, with an input field that is going to allow them to save and make the changes on the back end. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and replace this with the following. So you want to go ahead and delete here this p tag, and then replace this with an if statement. So if editing, and go ahead and also close it. We're going to add a form here. It is going to have no action, and the class is going to be relative. So this is essentially going to be position relative. So we can then make something absolute inside of this, and you're going to see what I mean by that in just a second. So we can add the check button that is going to allow us to save this particular form input. And then the type in here is going to be text, so we need to add an input. We're going to bind this value to task.name, and then the class is going to be height 8, border gray 300, and then on hover the border is going to be of gray 500. We also want to disable here outline none, then focus ring 2. On focus, we also want this ring to be blue 300. We also want the border to be blue 500. And finally, this is going to be rounded, so this is going to have the border radius again of 8 pixels. So now if we move, actually if we move back there, nothing happens. Let's just move this here to editing true, and now as you can see, we should see something similar to this each time that the person clicks here. Now let's move this, make sure that you leave this false by default, because every time that someone loads the page, it is not going to actually show any kind of input, but only the text. Then we also want to go ahead and add in here button, and this is going to have the class of absolute top 1 half actually, so this is essentially 50%. Then we want minus translate y also 50%, so this is essentially going to translate at minus 50%. And then we want to have here right 2. And now inside of this, we want to essentially do the following. Just like before, we want to go ahead and go here to hero icons and look for some kind of icon that we can use to identify essentially that the person is going to be using this button in order to save the changes. Now we can use something like this, so let's go ahead and simply use this check 1, and we can paste this in here. And again, just like before, let's move this to with 5 and height 5, which equals 20 pixels. And now make sure that you move this thing inside here of the form, because I made this mistake. And now let's go ahead and move this here back to editing true. So as you can see, now we have in here a button that we can click, and then we're going to be submitting a form with the new value that we're going to pass in here. Now let's go ahead and go back to the file, set this as editing false, and set inside of here an else statement. Now again, if this is editing, we're going to show all of this. If we are not editing, we simply want to show again the same thing as before. So in here, we simply want to show task.name. So now if we move back here to the application and we click here, you're going to see that nothing happens at the moment. And that's because we want to move here back to the file, to the task.svelte component file, and on click, we want the following to happen. We want to essentially set editing equals true. So now if we go back here, as you can see, each time that we click here, we are setting this as editing equals true. But although this updates, so again, if we click here, it appears here the input that we want, it doesn't focus by default. And if, for example, I want to go ahead and edit this task and I start typing, nothing happens because I need to manually come here, click and start typing. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do right now. So start by first of all importing in here after update from Svelte. So just like that, after update, and then go ahead and do the following. So we're going to first of all set here the input value. So we're going to be tracking the input in here. And then after the update, we want to run a function where if this is editing, we want to go ahead and input that focus. And finally, we want to move here to our input, not this one, which is of type task. And we want to bind here this to the input. So essentially this on mount, this is going to bind this entire element to this variable right over here. So let me just draw to make it simpler to understand. So on mount, this is going to go ahead and bind this here. And then we're going to be able to essentially, after that, so after the update, we're going to grab this here and we're simply going to go ahead and focus if this is editing. So again, also this is happening only inside of this component, so you don't have to worry about this running on any of the other tasks because we are again iterating and this is going to all be contained here inside of each one of these things. So here is a component, here is another component, and so on and so on. So now if we go ahead and click here, as you can see, it now focuses by default, so we can start typing in here. So we can then make changes to it. So now we need to move back here and essentially add the ability for us to actually update this on a server. Because if we go ahead and click, nothing happens at the moment, but we're going to make that happen. So let's start by typing here function update. And this function is again going to be fetching. So we're going to be again using the fetch API. And we want to make a request to localhost 9000. Again, tasks, and then here task.id. And the method is going to be again of type patch. And if you went over the previous video, you might recall that on that video we essentially create the same endpoint for updating the name and the done status. So each time that we want to toggle it, but inside of the code we then have logic to essentially, if we don't have any kind of done state passed to the function from the request, we only update the one that essentially we are passing. So if we only have a name, we update the name. If we only have the done state, we only update the done state. So we don't need two different requests, but here on the front end, we can essentially separate them to make this easier to build. So now let's go ahead and also add in here the headers application JSON. And just like before, we need to go ahead and pass in here a stringified body where the name is going to be input.value. Now again, because we went ahead and binded here this to the input, we can simply pass this in here and it's going to automatically have this value of this input. So anything that we type in here is going to then be reflected here. We're going to then send this request to the backend. It is also going to be already updated on the front end because we've already typed and this binds everything automatically. So this is all going to be working great and allow us to essentially update a task and see the change on the front end immediately. So then if all of this again goes well, so we're going to be using here the then method, we want to set editing as false. So now let's go ahead and move here to the form. So here on the form tag, you want to go ahead and type in here on submit. And also let's go ahead and prevent here the default. So this automatically calls here, that you can see event.prevent default, which is something very usual inside of web development on the front end. We usually submit, and if you're familiar, let's say with React, we then prevent the default and then we do something with the data, but this provides here this thing, which makes it very, very simple. And then we want to run here the update function. And I actually typed this wrong, so let's go ahead and make sure that this is on submit. And now this is not complaining anymore. And we can now go ahead, move here back to our browser, and let's say that instead of washing the dishes, we want to make food for dinner. Now if we go ahead, click here, as you can see, this now changes to make food for dinner. If we go ahead and refresh this, it stays persistent, and that's because it went ahead. And if we go ahead now and move here to this file, as you can see, this is now make food for dinner. So now let's go ahead and add the ability to create a new task. Now, because each time that we create a new task, we don't have to interact with the current tasks, we are now going to be moving back here to the tasks.svelte component. And here below this each statement, we want to add essentially the following. We want to go ahead and add also a form. And the class is going to be flex items stretch. Then this is going to be relative. And the padding on the right and left is going to be of 2, top and bottom of 4. And now here inside of this form, we want to also go ahead and add an input of type text. The placeholder is going to be task name. And the class is going to be border gray 300, hover border gray 500, outline none, focus ring 2, focus ring blue 300, and then also on focus the border is going to be blue. And finally we want to add rounded, but only on the left. So we're going to make it like this, and as you can see, it adds here top left radius 8 pixels and bottom left radius 8 pixels. So now let's go ahead and add the button that is going to allow us essentially to submit this input. And again, the reason that we are adding only rounded on the left is because we want to have similar to this, we want to have an input in here and then a button right next to it. So we essentially only want to have on this input that we just created here on the left the rounded corners, and then on the button we're only going to add corners that are rounded in here, so here it stays normally. So now let's go ahead and create here this button. The class is going to be, the width is going to be of 11, which equals 44 pixels. And then we're going to add this flex items center. Then we want to go ahead and justify this to the center, background blue 700, and all of this. So flex item center and justify center means that we want to center everything that is inside of this tag in the middle. And then we also want on hover to have background blue 800, and then text is going to be white, outline none, the focus again ring 2, then also on focus this is going to be ring blue 300, and finally, just like I said, here we want rounded on the right and large. And now let's go ahead and look here for an icon that we can use to make sure that this is visually understandable each time that someone wants to create a new task. So we want to go ahead and look here for this plus sign, and we can just keep it simple, copy this one right over here. And then on this case, we can leave it here as width 6 and height 6, because this one is going to be a bit bigger than the other ones. And now if we move back here to our browser, as you can see, we now have here a good looking input that we can use to essentially create new tasks. So now let's go ahead and move here inside of the script tag, and we want to do the following. Let's start by first of all creating in here a new input variable. And then we need to go ahead and create a new function, which is going to be called create. And then similarly to before, we need to go ahead and use here the fetch API to localhost 9000 and simply to tasks. But in this case, the method is going to be of post. Now again, if you're familiar with REST APIs, you'll know that post essentially means that we want to create something new on the backend, and that's also the reason that we don't pass in here any kind of ID, because we simply want to send the request, make sure that this gets created, and then show the difference on the front end. The headers, again, let's simply go ahead, copy the headers from here, so we don't have to type this again. And then the body is going to be json.stringify, and then we simply need to pass in here the name. Now again, if you watch the previous video, you'll know that in this case the done state is going to by default be false, which is usually what happens inside of to-do list applications, and the ID is going to simply be inferred from the last existing task. So it essentially we essentially did the same thing that happens when a database increments. So we essentially calculate the length of all of the tasks and then add one new plus one, so it then creates the ID of the task. So then we want to go ahead and add in here the then method, and we want to do a couple of things. Also, this one has to be asynchronous, and we need to pass in here the response, and then we want to create the new task, which is going to be of await res.json. Again, don't forget to await always this JSON method, because if not, you're simply going to get back the promise, but not like the response from the promise, what the promise actually needs to return. And then we want to go ahead and do the following. We simply want to here manipulate here this mutable value tasks, and then we want to spread here the current tasks and add a task at the end. And we also want to go ahead and set the value as empty. Now what's happening in here is essentially the following. We want to go ahead and grab here the task from the database, so the database sends back the ID, the task name, and the status, which essentially is false, so the done state. And then we want to push this into the array. So what's happening here is essentially the following. We want to make sure that we have, so let me grab this thing right over here, and then we want to essentially have in here an array. We then spread this array over here, and then we pop a new, we place a new thing inside of the array right over here at the end. So this is essentially what's happening in here. And finally, we want to set the input value as empty, because each time that someone types a task and they press enter, we want that input to essentially be cleaned up. Now let's go ahead and move here to our form, and similarly to before, we want on submit to first of all prevent a default, and then we want to invoke this function. And also let's go ahead and here inside the input, we want to bind this to the input variable. And now if we go back here to our application, and let's say that we want to write a novel and that we want to make sure that we remember it, if we go ahead and now press enter, and as you can see, it shows up here, and if we refresh, it also is here again, because here this tasks.json file got updated on the backend. And I pressed enter, but if we type something else, let's say like this, and if I click here, also this gets created and it updates in here. Now let's just go ahead and delete this one, and now as you can see, this shows up right here. And now the last step is for us to be able to delete a task from this list. Now as you can see, at the moment we don't have any kind of button right here, but at the beginning here we created a flex div. So let's just take a look here. Yeah, exactly. So as you can see, we created this with the class of flex item center and then space x2, which essentially means that this is going to be flexing on the horizontal. We're going to align everything to the center. So you can imagine like a line. So we're going to have not this one. So we're going to have something like this. So we have a bunch of different elements, and if any of these ones are smaller, they are going to simply align like this, so on a centered line. Like, this is not perfect, but I think you get the point. So let's now go ahead and add the button that we're going to be needing in order to make sure that we can delete a task. So first of all, let's create in here a button. Then this is going to be text red 700, and on hover it is going to be also red but 800. And let's now go ahead and pick here a icon for this. So what usually happens inside of all applications, we have a trash to visually essentially for us to visualize what's happening with this thing. And also let's go ahead and replace this with 5 so it stays at 20 pixel width and height. Now let's go ahead and copy this pen right over here. So in the same fashion, we want to make sure that someone that's editing this with only a screen reader knows what's happening. So we want to delete the task in here. And now we want to go ahead and essentially delete this on the backend and then dispatch an event to this tasks.svelte component that is going to allow us to essentially delete the task by ID. Now here's exactly what I mean by this. We need to start by first of all importing here create event dispatcher from Svelte, and I could actually just leave it like this. So both of these are from Svelte. So we need to essentially import this thing, create event dispatcher, and then here let's put this on the bottom. We can simply make a new constant which is going to be called dispatch, which is going to be create event dispatcher. And then we can go ahead and create the function that is going to allow us to essentially delete this task. So we're going to be calling this one handle delete because we can't use inside of JavaScript just delete. So if we did something like this, this is, as you can see, the operand of delete must be a property reference. And then we'll go ahead and again use the fetch API and pass in here HTTP. So let's just go ahead and copy all of this to make this simpler. And again, just like before, we need to go ahead and pass in here tasks and then the task ID. But we need to change something here. Instead of the method being patch, we need to go ahead and delete this one. And we also don't need the body because when the backend knows the ID, it doesn't need to know any additional information. So we can leave it like this. So again, fetch in here this, and then the method is going to be delete, and the headers keep it the same as always, content type application JSON. And we want to finally pass in here the then method, and we only want to know when this succeeded. We don't need any type of information, so the request or anything like that, in order to be able to essentially dispatch now this event. So we're going to be calling this one delete, and then we want to simply pass in here an ID of task.id. And now what's going to happen is essentially we're going to have this right over here dispatch, and then in here the tasks.svelte component is going to be aware that this has just been dispatched, and then we can go ahead and update this on the front end. So we can essentially remove based on that particular ID this task from the list, and it is going to be automatically reflected on the front end after the data gets deleted on the backend. So now let's go ahead and go here to our delete button, and let's add in here on click. We want to delete, to handle delete. So now, just to make sure that this is all working, we're going to actually be console logging in here, deleted. And let's go ahead and inspect this in here. And now we can update this. And as you can see, it is deleted. And now if I refresh the page, we don't have that task anymore. But we also want to make sure that we don't have to refresh the page each time that this happens. So that's what we're going to be doing right now. So we can simply navigate here back to the tasks.svelte file. And let's add here two simple things. First of all, we need to add a handle delete function. And we need to pass in here the event. And then we simply want to make sure that the tasks value gets updated to tasks.filter. And then we want to pass in here our task. So we're essentially iterating over all of the tasks. And then we essentially want to keep all of the tasks where the task.id is different from the event.detail.id. Now, the reason that we in here, so as you can see, we have in here event.detail.id, but in this case, we don't. We only have, as you can see, ID. So we don't have in here a detail object. So a detail key and then with an object inside of it is because by default, Svelte puts this inside the detail object, which is how this event API works inside of JavaScript. So it keeps it very similar to its core, to how JavaScript actually works. So that's the reason we have in here event.detail.id, and in here we only have the ID directly. And finally, we want to make sure that we are listening to this event. So we're going to simply move here to our task component, and then on delete, we want to handle the deletion. So now if we move here back to the application, as you can see, let's say that we want to delete here this go to bed task. If we click here, it gets deleted not only here inside of the backend, so we now don't have this task right over here, but it also gets automatically deleted in here. So let's add this, for example, back again. It shows up in here, and now we can delete it. And even if we don't refresh, we can simply go ahead, add it, delete it, and all of this works. So again, inside of reading a book, we want to write a book. We can actually update all of this. And that's it. We now have a fully working, simple to-do list application that we've built with a Go backend and a Svelte front end. And we can now create tasks, delete the tasks, update the tasks, name and that state. And we can also go ahead and see all of the current tasks that we have available inside of the application. So let me know in the comments below what you think of it. Also leave a like below if you thought this was helpful to you, and subscribe to get notified of future content.